In the winter of 1943, as the Eastern Front hardened into a landscape of ice, ash, and exhaustion, war had already consumed millions of lives. Entire armies moved and died according to messages carried through the air. Bursts of radio static translated into orders, coordinates, fate. It was here, amid retreat and desperation, that an anomaly appeared. He was 15 years old. Not a soldier by training, not an officer by rank, but a boy whose war began not with a rifle, but with a receiver dial. The Red Army's communications network was widely regarded as formidable. Hardened by years of combat, protected by layers of encryption and procedural discipline, Soviet radio traffic seemed beyond the reach of improvisation. German intelligence believed that only trained specialists, equipped with proper facilities, stood any chance of understanding it. This confidence was not arrogance alone. It was based on doctrine, experience, and precedent. The airwaves, they believed, were secure. The irony lay in how fragile that belief truly was. In a cramped room far from the front lines, using scavenged components and wire stripped by hand, the teenager assembled a radio set of his own design. It was crude by military standards, unstable and temperamental. Yet it worked. With careful tuning and patient listening, he began to isolate Soviet transmissions, patterns in the noise, repetitions in the chaos. What professionals dismissed as impossible, he approached as a puzzle. Each session carried risk. Unauthorized radio equipment could draw suspicion. A careless transmission might be traced. Discovery would not lead to reprimand, but to interrogation and likely worse. Still, night after night, he listened. He wrote. He learned. The war outside pressed inward, but his world narrowed to frequencies, timings, and the quiet discipline of focus. At 15, he understood what many adults did not. That intelligence was not only a product of hierarchy, but of attention. Gradually, fragments became meaning. Locations, unit movements, logistical rhythms, small pieces of a much larger machine. His findings reached ears that mattered. Reports were checked, then checked again. Against expectation, they held. A boy, armed with little more than curiosity and resolve, had pierced a system designed to resist entire departments of trained analysts. What had begun as a private experiment was now impossible to ignore. In a war defined by mass and machinery, an individual mind had found leverage. And as his intercepts grew more precise, those around him began to realize that this unlikely advantage would demand something more than improvisation. Somewhere beyond his improvised workspace, others were already considering how far this discovery could be taken, and at what cost. By 1944, the Eastern Front had become a war of control as much as firepower. Every movement of men and armor depended on communication, and communication, in turn, was guarded with obsessive care. Soviet radio discipline was designed to deny the enemy even the smallest advantage. Frequencies shifted, codes rotated, operators trained to transmit quickly and vanish into the noise. To most German planners, the idea that an unsanctioned listener could follow these signals bordered on fantasy. Yet the boy listened all the same. From his improvised position far closer to the front than was ever intended for someone his age, he learned the habits of Soviet operators, the cadence of their speech, the pauses between messages, the moments when urgency overrode caution. What intelligence manuals treated as theory, he experienced as sound. Crackling bursts of Morse, distorted voices cutting through static. He was not meant to hear them. That, perhaps, was why he could. The irony was difficult to ignore. While dedicated units struggled to penetrate Soviet transmissions with specialized equipment and formal procedures, a radio assembled in a bedroom accomplished what entire departments could not. Its success did not come from power or sophistication, but from proximity and patience. The front, dangerous and unstable, brought signals closer, louder, more careless. War itself had created the vulnerability. But every success tightened the noose. Unauthorized radio activity invited scrutiny from both sides. A signal traced by Soviet direction-finding teams could bring artillery or patrols. A report overheard by German authorities could raise questions no teenager could answer safely. Each time he adjusted the dial, he understood that the same air carrying information could also carry his location. Silence, too long or too sudden, could be as dangerous as sound. Still, the intercepts continued. Locations of supply depots, timing of troop movements, small details, individually unremarkable, collectively revealing intent. His notes grew thicker, his confidence quieter. He did not celebrate, he listened. And as the information flowed upward, those receiving it began to grasp the scale of what was happening. In a war that punished the careless and the slow, a fragile advantage had emerged from an unlikely place. But advantage invites attention, and attention brings consequence. Somewhere beyond the reach of his receiver, forces were already moving, drawn not by gunfire, but by the quiet evidence that the front was speaking and someone was finally listening. The radio did not begin as a weapon. It began as fragments, discarded coils, cracked headphones, wire pulled from ruined appliances. In 1943, material shortages were a fact of daily life across Germany, and precision components were reserved for the front. What remained were leftovers, the unusable, the forgotten. For a 15-year-old with patience and mechanical intuition, they were enough. Piece by piece, he assembled a device that no requisition order would ever have approved. Those who knew of his efforts were skeptical. Technical mastery in wartime was associated with uniforms, training manuals, and factories. It was not expected to emerge from a bedroom desk or a makeshift workbench. Even sympathetic adults assumed the project would end in frustration. Radios, after all, demanded stability and calibration. They were not toys. They were instruments of state power. That assumption proved mistaken. The radio's simplicity became its strength. Lacking standardized components, it was adaptable. Where military sets relied on fixed tolerances, his device could be tuned by ear and feel. He learned how heat affected frequency, how humidity altered reception, how static itself could be read as information. The imperfections that engineers worked to eliminate became signals in their own right. The war, noisy and unpredictable, spoke more clearly to an imperfect machine. Progress came through failure, circuits burned out, signals vanished without warning. Each mistake carried urgency, time spent repairing was time exposed. Radio work left traces, patterns of activity that could be noticed, questioned. He worked quickly, quietly, often in darkness. The threat was constant but abstract, a pressure rather than a presence. Still, it shaped every decision. Gradually, the radio stabilized. Reception sharpened. Transmission became possible, then reliable. What had been curiosity turned into capability. The device could hear what it was never meant to hear and speak without being immediately discovered. It was not powerful, but it was precise, and precision in intelligence mattered more. By surpassing expectations that had never been meant for him, the boy crossed an invisible line. His work was no longer a private experiment. It was an asset. Somewhere beyond his small workspace, others were beginning to realize that this fragile machine represented something larger, a breach in assumptions that could not be repaired easily, and a problem that would soon demand an answer. For much of the war, Soviet troop movements were treated as an enigma. The Red Army advanced behind layers of deception, maskirovka, misdirection, and disciplined silence. To German commanders, the enemy's intentions were often revealed only after tanks appeared on the horizon. Maps were updated too late. Intelligence arrived already obsolete. The belief that Soviet movements could not be tracked with precision became an accepted truth, shaping decisions across the front. That belief began to fracture in the quiet space between transmissions. As the teenager listened, patterns emerged. Units identified themselves by habit rather than code. Timetables repeated. A request for fuel, a report of bridge capacity, a brief exchange about weather, each seemed insignificant alone. Together, they formed a moving picture. He was not intercepting secrets so much as observing routine, the overlooked language of an army in motion. What shocked those who later read his reports was not only their accuracy, but their origin. A boy operating without rank or protection was hearing what trained soldiers with formal equipment could not. His intercepts revealed staging areas before attacks, shifts in supply routes, moments when Soviet formations paused or accelerated. The information did not arrive with certainty, but with probability, and in war, probability often decides outcomes. The irony was unavoidable. Intelligence that eluded entire sections of the military now rested with someone legally too young to serve. He did not see himself as an operative. He saw himself as a listener, yet the consequences of listening were no longer theoretical. Each decoded message carried weight. Each decision to forward information risked exposure. Transmission had to be brief, irregular, and masked within the noise of the front. Deciphering the messages demanded discipline. Codes changed. Operators adapted. He learned to recognize voices, to anticipate phrasing, to sense when urgency stripped away caution. His notes became dense with shorthand and margin marks. Time was the enemy. Delay could render intelligence useless. T could reveal his position. He balanced between them, aware that a single mistake could end not only his work, but his life. Slowly, the role changed him. Curiosity hardened into responsibility. The homemade radio, once an experiment, became an instrument of consequence. Information he intercepted began to influence deployments, warnings, expectations. He would never see the results directly. The battlefield remained distant, abstract, but its movements were no longer invisible. In the shadow war of signals and silence, an unlikely figure had crossed into dangerous territory. The front was no longer something he listened to, it was something he shaped, quietly and unknowingly. And as his reach expanded, so too did the risk that someone, somewhere, would begin to listen back. By the time his work began to matter, the danger had already doubled. Discovery could come from either direction. Soviet patrols searched relentlessly for unauthorized transmitters, knowing that a single radio could compromise an entire sector. At the same time, German authorities viewed unsanctioned intelligence work with equal suspicion. In a system built on control, deviation invited punishment. One mistake, one mistimed signal, one careless word, could end not only the operation but the life behind it. He understood this with unusual clarity. Every action was deliberate. Transmissions were short, irregular, carefully timed to blend with background interference. He learned when not to speak, when silence offered more protection than speed. Precision became instinctive. The belief that survival depended on discipline was not theoretical. It was reinforced each time he powered down and waited, listening for sounds beyond the radio that might indicate attention he did not want. The irony was stark. While his own safety narrowed to a fragile margin, the information he passed along widened the margin for others. Warnings arrived sooner. Units adjusted before contact. Lives were spared without ever knowing the source. He would never meet those affected by his work, never see the moments when a repositioned battery or delayed advance altered an outcome. The distance between cause and effect was vast, but the connection was real. Operating under that pressure took a toll. Fear was constant but muted, pushed aside by necessity. Complex equipment demanded steady hands even when the mind raced. Circuits failed at the worst moments. Signals faded just as urgency peaked. Each problem had to be solved quickly, quietly, without outside help. There was no room for panic. There was only the next adjustment, the next decision. What sustained him was not recklessness, but control. He learned to think several steps ahead, to prepare for failure as carefully as for success. If questioned, he rehearsed explanations. If traced, he planned routes of escape. The war taught him early that intelligence work was less about brilliance than about restraint, the ability to act without being seen. In time, it became clear that the radio alone was not what made the difference. Technology created opportunity, but it was judgment that preserved it. Courage was measured not by boldness, but by consistency, by showing up night after night, knowing the risk and choosing care over haste. As the front shifted and the volume of intercepted traffic grew, so did the likelihood that someone would notice the pattern. The space in which he operated was shrinking, and in the tightening silence between transmissions, the question was no longer whether discovery was possible, but how long it could be delayed. What began as curiosity could not remain innocent for long. In war, information does not exist in isolation, it demands use. At first, the teenager listened simply to understand, to see whether patterns existed at all. But as his intercepts accumulated and their accuracy was confirmed, the purpose shifted. What he heard was no longer interesting. It was actionable, and once intelligence proves reliable, it inevitably becomes strategy. The shock came quietly. Reports derived from his listening began to align with events at the front. Soviet movements were anticipated rather than reacted to. Artillery was repositioned before contact. Units avoided pressure points they would otherwise have blundered into blindly. These were not sweeping victories, but subtle advantages. Time gained, losses reduced, decisions informed rather than guessed. In a war of attrition, such margins mattered. The irony was profound. A project born in a bedroom, guided by intuition rather than doctrine, was now shaping decisions made by officers with years of training. The teenager would never sit at their tables or see their maps. His name carried little weight, yet the information he provided altered how those maps were read. Authority did not know him, but it depended on him all the same. As the audience for his intelligence widened, so did the pressure. Accuracy became non-negotiable, a single misinterpret. Asian could mislead an entire formation. He learned to distinguish certainty from possibility, to mark what he knew from what he inferred. Secrecy, once personal, now became institutional. The fewer who understood the source, the safer it remained. He operated in isolation, bound by responsibility but denied recognition. This phase of the war demanded a different discipline. Listening was no longer enough. He had to think like the enemy, to anticipate not just what was said, but why. He studied how Soviet units behaved under stress, how patterns shifted before an attack or after a setback. Over time, anticipation replaced reaction. His work moved ahead of events, not behind them. What emerged was not a miracle, but a lesson. Armies are vast, but they are also habitual. They repeat what works until it fails. Under the right conditions, a single attentive mind can exploit that repetition. Not through brilliance alone, but through patience, context, and restraint. By the time his role was fully understood by those who needed it, the line had already been crossed. Curiosity had hardened into responsibility. A boy had become an invisible strategist, operating without protection, credit, or certainty of survival. And as his insights shaped more decisions, one reality became unavoidable. The more valuable his intelligence became, the more dangerous it was for him to continue providing it. By late 1944, the war on the Eastern Front had entered a quieter, more cerebral phase, at least in the airwaves. Soviet commanders had begun to sense that something was wrong. Operations were being anticipated too often. Movements once concealed were now met with preparation. The conclusion was unavoidable. Their communications were being compromised. In response, radio security tightened. Codes were revised more frequently. Transmission times were shortened. Operators were instructed to speak less, move more, and trust no pattern for long. For German intelligence, this shift signaled danger. For the teenager listening in the shadows, it signaled escalation. What had once been routine listening became a contest of adaptation. Familiar voices disappeared. Established rhythms dissolved. The radio filled with gaps and false leads. Silence, once a backdrop, became a weapon. The struggle was no longer simply to hear, but to understand what was missing. The irony of the moment was sharp. The very measures designed to block interception created new habits, new stresses, new errors. In the urgency to remain secure, Soviet operators occasionally broke their own discipline, repeating phrases, reverting to familiar shorthand, transmitting just long enough to be understood. The teenager noticed these deviations. He always had. Where doctrine assumed uniformity, he looked for fatigue. Each intercepted message now carried greater weight and greater risk. Direction-finding technology had improved. Soviet counterintelligence units actively hunted unauthorized transmitters. The margin for error narrowed to seconds. He shortened his listening windows, moved locations when possible, adjusted frequencies constantly. There was no room for routine. Survival depended on variation. The pressure was relentless. He could no longer rely on familiarity. Every session began as if from zero. He studied changes in code structure, learning not just what symbols meant, but how they evolved. When encryption tightened, he focused on metadata, who was speaking when and for how long. Even silence had meaning. Delays suggested confusion. Sudden bursts hinted at urgency. The radio no longer told stories. It offered clues. This was the battle of wits that no communique would ever record. No gunfire marked its victories. No map could show its front lines. It was fought in attention spans and reaction times, in the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could enforce discipline. The teenager's greatest advantage was not his equipment, but his flexibility. He had no procedures to protect, no hierarchy to satisfy. He changed instantly because he could. Yet the cost of failure had never been higher. A single trace could bring soldiers to his door. A single intercepted transmission sent too boldly could undo months of careful work. He lived with that knowledge constantly. Fear was no longer abstract, it was operational. He learned to function within it, to let it sharpen rather than paralyze. What emerged from this contest was a quiet truth about intelligence itself. Security is never absolute. Systems are built by people, and people tire, adapt imperfectly, and make assumptions. Against a sufficiently attentive mind, even the most disciplined structure reveals seams. Age, rank, and resources matter less than persistence and context. As Soviet protocols grew more complex, his methods grew more refined. He did not defeat their security, he stayed just ahead of it. That difference mattered. It kept information flowing when it should have stopped. It preserved an advantage that should not have existed. But this balance could not hold indefinitely. Every adjustment by one side provoked a response from the other. The contest tightened, faster and more unforgiving with each exchange. And somewhere within that accelerating cycle, the question shifted. It was no longer whether he could keep listening, but how long before the silence became permanent. The most disorienting aspect of his work was not the danger, but the contrast. By day, life continued in familiar rhythms. School lessons followed schedules. Family meals were eaten quietly, often with rationed food and unspoken worries. Neighbors spoke of air raids, shortages, sons at the front. By night, the same boy entered a different war entirely, one measured in frequencies and silences, where a wrong decision could carry consequences far beyond the room he sat in. The shock lay in how seamlessly these worlds overlapped. The prevailing belief of the era was simple. Children were observers, not participants. They endured war, suffered its losses, but did not shape its course. Decisions were made by generals and ministers, executed by soldiers whose names filled casualty lists, yet beneath that structure, exceptions existed. Quiet ones. The teenager's contribution did not fit the accepted image of warfare, and perhaps that was why it endured unnoticed for so long. The irony was stark. While adults moved divisions across maps and debated strategy in protected rooms, a 15-year-old interpreted the enemy's intentions with tools built from scrap. His battlefield was invisible, his victories unacknowledged. He carried no rank, wore no uniform, and received no salutes. Still, his work reached into decisions made far beyond his years. Authority and age had diverged, and in that gap, effectiveness found space to operate. The strain of this dual existence accumulated slowly. Secrecy was absolute. He could not explain his absences, his exhaustion, the moments when his attention drifted during ordinary conversations. Fear followed him into mundane tasks. A knock at the door carried weight. A casual question lingered longer than it should. Responsibility, once abstract, became personal. He knew that errors could cost lives he would never see. Unlike soldiers at the front, there was no release valve. No shared hardship with comrades, no permission to speak openly. The isolation was complete. He bore knowledge without context, consequence without confirmation. When intelligence succeeded, there was silence. When it failed, there was uncertainty. The war asked much of him, but offered little in return. And yet he persisted, not from ideology or ambition, but from a sense that stopping would be worse than continuing. Once responsibility is accepted, it is difficult to abandon. His resilience was not loud. It was quiet, sustained by routine and restraint. He learned to compartmentalize, to return from the radio to homework, from intercepted plans to family conversations, as if no boundary had been crossed. What his story reveals is not simply precocity, but the nature of modern war. Total conflict does not respect age. It draws in those it needs, often without recognition or preparation. Intelligence work, especially, thrives in the margins, among those overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Youth, in this context, was not a weakness. It was camouflage. Across the 20th century, countless similar stories went unrecorded. Young minds pressed into adult responsibilities by circumstance rather than choice. Some were noticed, most were not. Their contributions folded quietly into outcomes attributed to larger forces. History remembers victories and defeats, but rarely the individuals who shaped them from the shadows. As the war moved toward its final, brutal phase, the teenager remained where he had always been, between worlds. Too young to be counted, too effective to be ignored. And while armies continued to clash openly across continents, one question lingered unspoken. How long could a child carry the weight of a war that refused to see him at all? The effects of his work did not arrive as headlines or turning points. They appeared quietly, almost anonymously, in the margins of operations. A unit delayed its advance by hours. An artillery battery shifted position before dawn. A supply column altered its route and avoided contact. On paper, these decisions seemed routine, even mundane. But behind them lay information that should not have existed. Details gathered not by reconnaissance aircraft or forward patrols, but by a homemade radio operated by a teenager far from the map tables. The struggle now lay in consequence rather than collection. Intelligence, once intercepted, had to be interpreted and applied with restraint. His reports did not promise certainty. They offered likelihoods, warnings, indications. Officers learned to treat them as one input among many. Yet time and again those inputs proved correct. Small tactical choices, where to wait, what to avoid, began to tilt subtly in one direction. Losses were reduced. Encounters unfolded differently than expected. The front did not shift dramatically, but it shifted enough. The irony deepened with each confirmation. A child's ingenuity, dismissed by doctrine and invisible to ceremony, had become a weapon as effective as many sanctioned assets. It required no fuel convoys, no factories, no replacement crews. It relied instead on patience, interpretation, and the fragile continuity of secrecy. In an industrial war defined by scale, this advantage remained resolutely human. What made the impact possible was not brilliance alone, but timing. The Eastern Front in its later years was fluid and overstretched. Both sides operated under pressure with limited reserves and imperfect information. In such an environment, even minor foreknowledge mattered. Knowing when an attack was likely, not certain but likely, allowed commanders to prepare psychologically as much as materially. Surprise was blunted. Confusion shortened. Reaction replaced shock. The teenager never saw these effects directly. He did not witness engagements altered by his listening, nor hear after-action reports praising foresight. Feedback, when it came at all, was indirect. A request for continued monitoring, a note indicating that previous information had been useful. The distance between effort and result remained vast, but usefulness in wartime intelligence was confirmation enough. There was also a limit to what his work could achieve. He did not decide campaigns or redirect armies. His influence was localized, conditional, dependent on others to act wisely. This, too, was part of the revelation. War is not changed only by grand innovations or famous names. It is shaped continuously by small decisions made slightly better than they would have been otherwise. Accumulated, those decisions alter outcomes that history later attributes to momentum or fate. The strain persisted. Success did not reduce risk, it intensified it. As intelligence proved valuable, the incentive to continue grew stronger even as the dangers mounted. The radio remained fragile. His position remained exposed, yet stopping felt increasingly impossible. The war had accepted his contribution, quietly and without consent. Responsibility, once assumed, does not easily release its hold. What his story ultimately demonstrates is scale without insignificance. The teenager did not overturn the Eastern Front, but he influenced moments within it. Moments where fewer men died, where chaos was reduced, where choice replaced surprise. In the arithmetic of war, such moments rarely earn footnotes, yet they accumulate all the same. Ingenuity in this sense was not an abstract virtue. It was practical, constrained, and deeply human. It did not promise victory, it offered clarity. And clarity in a conflict defined by uncertainty was power enough. As the war ground onward toward its brutal conclusion, the value of his work was no longer in question. What remained uncertain was its sustainability. Each success carried the seed of exposure. Each corrected decision suggested an unseen hand at work. And somewhere within the opposing apparatus, the silence was beginning to feel intentional, an absence that demanded explanation. Recognition, when it came, arrived without ceremony. There was no promotion, no formal acknowledgement, no public record. Instead, his reports began traveling farther up the chain than before. Questions followed, carefully phrased, deliberately vague. Requests became more specific. Timelines mattered. Confidence, once tentative, hardened into expectation. Somewhere within the intelligence apparatus, higher-ranking officers had concluded that the information was not coincidence. It was capability. The shock was not that his intelligence was useful, but that it endured scrutiny. In a system trained to distrust anomalies, reliability was the only currency that mattered. His intercepts continued to align with events. Predictions held. Warnings arrived early enough to matter. Gradually, reliance replaced curiosity. Decisions were now made with the assumption that his perspective would be available. A 15-year-old, unknown by name to most, had become embedded in the machinery of war. This belief that a child could function as a military asset ran against every convention. Intelligence work was meant to be centralized, controlled, and professionalized, yet war has little patience for convention when results are at stake. His age became irrelevant not because it was overlooked, but because it could not compete with accuracy. The system did not celebrate him, it absorbed him. The irony sharpened with proximity. Officers who had spent careers learning how to think like the enemy now depended on insights provided by someone who had learned by listening. His advantage was not education or authority, but freedom from assumption. He had no doctrine to defend and reputation to preserve. Where others filtered information through expectation, he took it as it came. In that difference, he stayed ahead. With credibility came responsibility. Requests now carried consequences. Intelligence forwarded at the wrong moment could mislead an entire formation. Silence, when information existed, could be just as damaging. He became acutely aware of the weight attached to each judgment. The war no longer passed through his radio alone. It paused there, briefly, waiting for interpretation. This was the turning point. The work ceased to be reactive. He was no longer merely intercepting and reporting. He was anticipating needs, listening for what commanders would ask next, adjusting focus based on operational tempo rather than curiosity. The distance between his small, improvised station and the battlefield narrowed, not physically, but causally. His decisions now influenced the timing and direction of others. And still the contradictions persisted. He remained a schoolboy subject to routines that had nothing to do with war. He could not attend meetings or argue interpretations. He could only provide information and trust that it would be used wisely. Authority flowed in one direction, accountability flowed back. This imbalance demanded restraint. He learned to express uncertainty clearly, to resist the temptation of overconfidence. Precision mattered more than speed. What sustained his position was consistency. In an environment defined by collapse and retreat, reliability was rare. His intelligence did not promise victory, but it reduced surprise. It allowed those making decisions to feel, briefly, less blind. That alone was invaluable. The smallest operator had become indispensable not through scale, but through steadiness. His story reveals a deeper truth about extreme pressure. When systems are strained to their limits, they become porous. Rank matters less than results. Experience matters less than adaptability. In such moments, courage is not always visible. It appears instead as persistence, the willingness to continue operating under risk without recognition or reassurance. By now, his role sat at the center of something he could not fully see. He knew only fragments: requests received, information sent, silence returned. The war pressed inward from all sides, demanding more while offering no guarantee of survival. He had crossed into a space where withdrawal was no longer a simple choice. And yet, for all the responsibility he carried, his greatest advantage remained unchanged. He was underestimated. As long as that held, he could listen, he could think, he could stay ahead. But wars do not end quietly, and neither do secrets. As the conflict approached its final, chaotic phase, the machinery around him began to fracture. Structures failed. Loyalties shifted. And the question that now loomed was no longer whether his intelligence would be used, but whether the world he operated within would survive long enough for it to matter at all. Awareness arrived gradually on the Soviet side, not as certainty but as unease. Operations failed in ways that felt unnatural. Units encountered resistance where none was expected. Supply routes were avoided with improbable precision. At first, these were dismissed as coincidence, the inevitable friction of a vast front. But as patterns repeated, coincidence lost its credibility. Somewhere, information was escaping. Soviet counterintelligence began to respond in the only way it could, by assuming penetration. Investigations widened. Radio discipline was enforced with renewed severity. Operators were questioned, logs scrutinized. Direction-finding units were deployed with greater frequency and authority. The airwaves, once crowded and careless under pressure, grew colder. Fewer words were spoken, fewer mistakes forgiven. For those listening illegally, the environment became hostile. For the teenager, this marked a new phase of struggle. The danger was no longer abstract or distant. It had shape and intent. Somewhere beyond his awareness, trained professionals were actively searching for the source of compromise. Every transmission he intercepted now existed within an adversarial framework. He was no longer exploiting oversight. He was evading pursuit. The irony was complete. The very intelligence he provided, accurate, timely, disruptive, had forced his enemies to adapt. Their tightening security was a reaction to his success, yet even as procedures hardened, gaps remained. Perfection is difficult under fire. Fatigue introduces variation. Urgency creates shortcuts. The teenager learned to focus not on what had changed, but on what could not change: human behavior. He reduced his footprint further. Listening sessions grew shorter. Transmission schedules became irregular to the point of seeming random. He altered locations when possible, never settling into habit. When signals disappeared entirely, he waited. Patience became a defensive weapon. Intelligence work is often imagined as active, but survival depends just as much on restraint. Knowing when not to listen was now as important as knowing how. This period marked a turning point in his craft. Remaining undetected was no longer a condition of success, it was the success. Each day he continued to operate without discovery confirmed his skill. He learned to read absence as carefully as presence. A sudden silence might indicate a security sweep. A return to normal traffic might signal false confidence. The radio no longer spoke plainly. It whispered, hinted, withheld. What distinguished him was adaptability. He had no fixed methods to protect, no bureaucracy to slow adjustment. When the environment shifted, he shifted with it. Trained operators relied on procedure. He relied on perception. That difference allowed him to remain one step ahead, not because he was invulnerable, but because he was flexible. The courage required during this phase was quieter than before. It was no longer the courage to begin, but the courage to continue knowing the odds were narrowing. Each intercepted message carried a calculation. Was the information worth the risk of listening? Each transmission outward asked a harder question. Was it worth revealing that someone was still there? And still he persisted, not recklessly, not heroically, but carefully. The balance he maintained was fragile. Intelligence work exists in the space between use and exposure. Lean too far toward silence and relevance disappears. Lean too far toward action and discovery follows. His survival depended on keeping that balance day after day. What his continued success illustrated was not invincibility, but the nature of intelligence itself. It is not a contest of strength, but of attention. Not a battle of weapons, but of assumptions. Even the most determined counterintelligence effort cannot erase uncertainty entirely. As long as someone is willing to watch closely enough, systems will betray themselves. For the Soviets, the investigation would never fully resolve. Suspicion widened, resources spread thin. For the teenager, the noose tightened but never closed. He remained present, effective, unseen. A problem that could not be located is a problem that cannot be eliminated. As the war staggered toward its final collapse, both sides sensed that time was running out. Structures strained. Priorities shifted. Counterintelligence competed with survival itself. And within that chaos, the teenager continued to listen, aware that every passing day was borrowed time and that the balance he had mastered could fail without warning. When the war ended, it did so without ceremony for those who had lived in its margins. Front lines dissolved. Intelligence networks were dismantled or buried beneath new priorities. Files were sealed, lost, or deliberately forgotten. For the teenager whose radio had spoken quietly into the chaos of the Eastern Front, there was no debrief that matched the weight of what he had carried. His work ended not with recognition, but with silence. The shock was not that his story faded, it was how completely it disappeared. In the accounting of victory and defeat, his contributions left only indirect traces. Reports influenced decisions that altered outcomes, but attribution dissolved as chains of command collapsed. The war moved on to tribunals, rebuilding, and memory. His name did not appear in headlines or memoirs, yet the effects of his listening had already passed into history, embedded in moments where surprise was avoided and losses quietly reduced. Intelligence rarely leaves fingerprints. The irony endured. A device built from scrap, operated by a boy considered irrelevant by every formal definition of power, had carried real battlefield consequences. It had not decided campaigns or rewritten strategy, but it had mattered where mattering was hardest to measure, at the level of timing, anticipation, and restraint. In an era obsessed with scale, his impact remained resolutely small and therefore easy to overlook. With distance came perspective. What had once felt like improvisation revealed itself as something more enduring. The lessons of his work did not belong to one uniform or one cause. Creativity under constraint, bravery without audience, technical skill applied not for recognition, but for necessity. These qualities did not expire with the war. They reappeared wherever individuals were forced to adapt faster than systems could respond. His turning point was not a single moment, but survival itself. He emerged from the war carrying knowledge he could not easily share, shaped by responsibilities he had never been meant to bear. Youth, once a disguise, returned as a reality. The world expected him to resume an ordinary life, unaware of how much of it had already been lived under extraordinary pressure. This dissonance between experience and acknowledgement was the final burden of secrecy. In time, fragments of his story surfaced, pieced together by historians attentive to the overlooked, not as legend, but as case study. His work illustrated how intelligence is not solely the domain of institutions, but of individuals able to see differently. It challenged assumptions about age, authority, and capability. Most of all, it demonstrated that modern war reaches far beyond the battlefield, drawing in those it neither prepares nor protects. The revelation of his legacy lies not in heroism, but in proportion. He was not extraordinary because he was fearless, but because he learned to function despite fear. Not because he possessed rare genius, but because he paid attention where others assumed nothing could be found. His story stands as a reminder that history is shaped not only by those who command, but by those who listen carefully enough to understand what is being missed. Across conflicts and generations, similar figures have existed, young, unacknowledged, operating in the quiet spaces between systems. Some are eventually recognized, most are not. Their contributions dissolve into outcomes attributed to strategy or chance. Yet without them, those outcomes would look subtly different. War magnifies power, but it also exposes vulnerability. Ingenuity thrives in that exposure. The teenage spy did not set out to make history. He responded to circumstance with curiosity, then with discipline, then with responsibility. Each step narrowed his options while expanding his impact. That progression, more than any single act, defines his legacy. It is the story of how ordinary capability becomes extraordinary under pressure. In the end, his radio fell silent, as all radios do. Frequencies cleared. The war receded into memory. What remained was an example, quiet, unresolved, and enduring, that even in the most mechanized conflict in history, a single young mind, armed with little more than attention and resolve, could bend events without ever being seen. History rarely pauses to notice such figures, but it is shaped by them nonetheless. Every act of intelligence carries a cost, but for the young, that cost is rarely measured honestly. In this case, the price was not paid in medals or recognition, but in risk accumulated quietly over time. Each intercepted transmission placed the teenager closer to discovery. Each decision to continue narrowed the margin between success and catastrophe. War did not pause to consider his age. It exposed him to the same consequences it imposed on anyone who interfered with its machinery. The danger he faced was absolute. Capture by Soviet forces would have meant interrogation without protection or status. Suspicion from German authorities could have led to equally final outcomes. He operated in a space where legality, loyalty, and survival overlapped imperfectly. Youth offered no shield. If anything, it increased vulnerability. The war asked adult sacrifices from a child and offered no framework to absorb the cost. The irony lies in how narrowly tragedy was avoided. Nothing in his circumstances guaranteed survival. His success was not the product of safety, but of restraint exercised under pressure. For every moment of insight, there were countless moments of waiting, withholding, choosing not to act. These decisions rarely appear in records, yet they define the difference between contribution and disappearance. Courage in this context was not dramatic, it was sustained. His story exemplifies a broader truth about wartime ingenuity. Innovation often emerges from necessity, but necessity is indifferent to who answers its call. The teenager's intelligence work did not belong to an abstract ideal of heroism. It was grounded in improvisation, fear, and responsibility assumed too early. The same qualities that made his work effective, attention, adaptability, independence, also isolated him. There was no one to share the burden, no institution prepared to protect him fully. What might have ended differently is not difficult to imagine. A signal traced one night earlier, a question asked by the wrong person, a single misjudgment under fatigue. History records none of these alternate paths, yet they were present at every step. That they did not occur does not diminish their weight. It underscores how fragile success can be when achieved outside formal protection. The revelation here is not that a child could influence war, but that war could demand such influence from a child at all. Intelligence and ingenuity are neutral traits. In the hands of the young, they do not lose power, but they magnify risk. The teenager's experience forces an uncomfortable reflection. Effectiveness does not equate to readiness, and contribution does not imply consent. And yet his actions cannot be reduced to victimhood. He chose to continue when stopping was possible, not because he sought danger, but because responsibility, once internalized, alters perception. He understood that his listening mattered. That understanding reshaped his threshold for risk. In doing so, he demonstrated a form of courage rarely acknowledged, the willingness to remain careful when boldness would have been easier. The price of his genius was not paid all at once. It accumulated in silence, in sleep lost, in vigilance maintained long after it was healthy to do so. Even after the war, its effects lingered. Experiences lived without acknowledgement do not simply dissolve. They shape judgment, restraint, and distance. Survival itself becomes complex when it carries memories no one else shares. His contribution could have ended as a footnote written in absence. Instead, it stands as an example, measured, unsettling, and instructive. It reminds us that intelligence work is not abstract, and that innovation often emerges from those least prepared to bear its consequences. Youth does not soften war's demands, it sharpens them. In the end, the price of genius was not glory or tragedy, but exposure. To danger, to responsibility, to history's indifference. That the teenager endured does not negate the cost, it defines it. And as the echoes of his story fade into broader memory, one question remains unresolved. How many others, equally young and equally capable, paid similar prices without ever being noticed at all? War leaves few people unchanged, and for those who enter it early, its imprint is permanent. The teenager who once listened quietly to the Eastern Front did not return to a world untouched by his experience. Risk had become familiar. Responsibility had arrived before its time. Innovation had ceased to be an exercise and become a necessity. These elements blended into a way of thinking that could not simply be set aside when the fighting stopped. The human cost of this transformation was subtle but enduring. He learned to measure words, to anticipate consequences, to hold information without sharing it. Such habits are useful in war and difficult in peace. Where others spoke freely, he calculated. Where others reacted, he observed. The front had taught him restraint more effectively than any classroom could. It had shaped not only what he knew, but how he moved through the world. The irony is that while adult commanders dominate the narratives of war, much of what determines outcomes happens far from their view. Orders are written by generals, but execution depends on countless unseen contributors. In his case, age offered neither authority nor exemption. It concealed him. That concealment became advantage. While others were constrained by expectation, he operated beyond it. His story disrupts the assumption that impact follows rank or years. Recognition, when it did not come, was not a surprise. His work had been designed to remain invisible. Intelligence that survives depends on anonymity, yet invisibility carries a cost. Without acknowledgement, experience remains uncontextualized. Sacrifice goes unshared. The war moved on, but the lessons remained embedded in him, unspoken and unresolved. What his feats ultimately reveal is not the romance of precocity, but the mechanics of contribution. Extraordinary outcomes do not always emerge from extraordinary resources. They emerge from attention applied at the right moment, from adaptability under pressure, from individuals willing to accept responsibility when systems falter. In wartime, those individuals are often found in unexpected places. His story also forces a reconsideration of heroism. There were no charges across open ground, no decorations pinned to uniforms. There was instead the steady discipline of listening, the courage of restraint, the patience to wait when action would have been more satisfying. This form of heroism leaves little for commemoration. It does not announce itself. It simply alters events and withdraws. The Eastern Front consumed millions, its violence overwhelming in scale. Against that backdrop, a single teenager's contribution might seem negligible. But war is not decided only by scale. It is decided by accumulation of decisions, of insights, of moments where surprise is avoided or opportunity recognized. His influence existed within that accumulation, shaping outcomes too small to headline and too important to ignore. What remains, then, is not a tale of exceptional youth, but of overlooked capacity. Age did not define his impact. Circumstance did. He was unsung not because his work lacked value, but because the war had no mechanism to honor such value. Silence was the price of effectiveness. In remembering figures like him, history broadens its lens. It moves beyond commanders and campaigns to acknowledge the quiet forces that shape events from the margins. The unsung hero is not defined by recognition, but by consequence. As the echoes of the Eastern Front recede into abstraction, his story persists as a reminder. That innovation often arises where necessity is greatest. That courage can be quiet and sustained. And that in the vast machinery of war, some of the most meaningful contribute. Tians come from those never meant to be there at all. What began as curiosity ended as influence. And though his name may never anchor a chapter, his impact remains embedded in the outcomes of a war that was shaped, in part, by someone history almost missed. In the end, the war does not remember him as it remembers generals or battles. It remembers outcomes, advances delayed, surprises blunted, losses reduced without explanation. Somewhere beneath those outcomes lies a quieter story, one that resists simple classification. At 15, he was not merely surviving a collapsing world. He was interpreting it. He was deciding what mattered, what could be known, and what risks were worth taking. To call him only a child would be inaccurate. To call him only a spy would be incomplete. He occupied a space between roles, shaped less by title than by function. He listened when others assumed nothing could be heard. He adapted when systems grew rigid. He exercised judgment in moments where delay or haste could both be fatal. In that sense, age ceased to define him. Responsibility did. The homemade radio stands at the center of this story not as a symbol of cleverness, but as a reminder of scale. It was small, fragile, and improvised. It lacked the authority of factory-built machines and the protection of official sanction, yet it proved sufficient. In war, sufficiency is often more powerful than perfection. What mattered was not how advanced the device was, but how attentively it was used. Through that attention, a single mind engaged an entire military system, not by confronting it directly, but by understanding its habits. Armies move by doctrine, but they communicate by people. People repeat themselves. They grow tired. They improvise under pressure. The teenager recognized this not because he had studied it formally, but because he listened long enough to notice. Intelligence, in its purest form, is patience applied with care. There is a temptation, in retrospect, to frame such stories as miracles, but nothing here was miraculous. It was incremental, built from trial and error, sustained by restraint rather than bravado. His success lay not in bold gestures, but in avoiding them. He remained effective precisely because he resisted the urge to be seen. The moral weight of his story rests in that restraint. War rewards decisiveness, but it punishes recklessness. He learned this early. Each choice to listen, to transmit, to remain silent was shaped by an awareness of consequence. Others made decisions that moved divisions. He made decisions that preserved invisibility. Both mattered. One was simply harder to recognize. His experience also challenges comfortable assumptions about power. We often imagine that influence flows downward from institutions to individuals. Here, it moved in reverse. A single teenager operating outside formal authority altered how information moved within an army, not permanently, not decisively, but meaningfully, enough to matter in moments where moments were all that existed. What does this tell us, finally, about war? That it is not only a contest of numbers and machines, but of perception. That creativity does not vanish under pressure, it concentrates. And that courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is the decision to keep listening when stopping would be safer. The teenager did not outsmart an army by defeating it. He outsmarted it by understanding it, by recognizing that even the largest systems are vulnerable to careful observation, by proving that intellect, applied at the right place and time, can create leverage far beyond its apparent size. When the radio fell silent, the war continued without him, but it did not continue unchanged. His influence had already been absorbed, diffused into decisions that history would later attribute to momentum or chance. That is often how intelligence ends, not with recognition, but with disappearance. And perhaps that is the final lesson. That history is shaped as much by those who remain unseen as by those who stand at the center of events. That ingenuity does not require permission, and that in the deadliest of circumstances, a single mind, curious, disciplined, and willing to accept responsibility, can still matter. At 15, he wasn't just a child. He was a strategist, a technician, and a spy. One teen, one homemade radio, and the audacity to outsmart an entire army.